the Middle Way Podcast with Pat and Saman.
Want to say hi to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Pat and
this is Saman. Welcome.
And we are with the Middle Way Podcast, and we want to just welcome everyone today. We've got a really exciting interview that we're looking forward to doing with Professor Anna Blakney with the School of Biomedical Engineering at the University of British Columbia. And she is someone we've been looking for who is an expert on vaccines. She is at the forefront of mRNA vaccine research and development. That's what she's focusing on at UBC. There's an area that she does work on particularly. We're not going to go into that so much today, but we might in a follow-up interview with her, and that is that she had explained to us before, prior to the interview, that one of the things she does in her field of research, and they've been developing, is making mRNA vaccines even safer in terms of side effects or adverse effects by lowering the actual mRNA dosage or viral load, not viral load, but mRNA load, by lowering actually the amount of mRNA used. And so and that's actually, they have a version of that vaccine that's already in clinical trials. So that's going to be coming out probably in the next little while, which is hopefully will even go further to making people feel more comfortable with those vaccines in terms of lessening any potential side effects. But we're really going to focus today in our conversation with her on having her maybe answer some of the questions you guys have actually posed to us, because we did put out to everyone, please send us in your questions, anything that you'd like us to ask her, pro or con. So she's going to be here to really take those questions in and give us the benefit of her.
That's right, Pat. You've got all of those questions with you, so I'm going to let you lead most of the interview as much as possible. I'll jump in if I've got anything special to ask, but since you've got all the questions, I'm going to let you basically lead the interview. And
very generous
let
of you.
Me know
you tell me I'm doing all the work.
You're going to do all the work today.
This episode, okay. You're doing it. I'll get you working on the next one more. Okay, sounds good. All right. So do you want to bring her in?
All right. Yeah, let's do it. Let's start.
Okay. So we want to welcome our special guest today, Professor Anna Blakney, the University of British Columbia.
Here we go.
So yes, so just wanted to introduce our guest today. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Anna Blakney, who's the Assistant Professor at the Michael Smith Laboratories and School of Biomedical Engineering from the University of British Columbia. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Blakney.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And I guess the first thing we just wanted to start off with is just if you could tell us a little bit about what your work is at UBC, how you're involved with the vaccines. That maybe would be a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. So my lab studies RNA vaccines and therapies. So in addition to thinking about, it's been, I would say, a great year for the field of RNA vaccines with the approval of the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines. But what we're trying to do is think about, okay, how do we make vaccines even better? And how do we apply them to other applications where I think RNA could have a big impact? So one of the ways we're doing this is we work with a specific type of RNA called self-amplifying RNA, which is just a fancy way of saying this RNA is able to copy itself once it gets into a patient's cells. And so this means we need a much lower dose than we would need with a typical messenger RNA. So we're thinking about ways of, new vaccines, new disease indications where we could make vaccines and treatments for these.
Interesting. So, and with that, just follow up to that. So with that technology and being able to have a lower dose of the mRNA, what are some of the advantages that would come with that?
Yeah, so there's a number of advantages. So obviously in the context of a pandemic, when we're trying to manufacture billions of vaccines, if you can use 10 or 100 times lower dose, that means that from each batch of vaccines that, we're currently producing, you'd have 10 or 100 times more doses. So it just goes a lot longer way. But this should also mean that it's, less expensive because it has less of the RNA in it. And we also know now that from studies have shown that there is a pretty direct relationship between the dose of RNA and the side effects that are associated with it. So if you got a COVID vaccine like the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines and you had any sort of side effects, that's usually correlated directly with the dose of RNA used. So we're always looking to minimize the actual dose of RNA.
Oh, that's great. So with that technology, then for folks that are having reactions, that's going to make it even easier to take.
Ideally, yeah. So actually, before I joined UBC in January, and prior to this, I was working as a postdoc at Imperial College London, and so I was part of the team there that did the first in human clinical trial with this type of RNA. And just to put it into perspective, our clinical trial used a range of doses from 0.1 to 10 micrograms, whereas the Moderna vaccine is 100 micrograms and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is 30 micrograms. So it's quite a lower range compared to that.
That's a big difference. I have heard or read it somewhere else that the Moderna dosage was higher, and that was possibly or theoretically why there were more side effects or symptoms to taking that. So that could be huge. So when do you think that technology might actually be put into play?
Yeah, good question. So I think, there's lots of people that are developing, kind of second generation vaccines for COVID, but also other indications. So hard to say exactly when it would get approved, just because it kind of depends on, obviously how the clinical trials go, et cetera. So we're waiting to see.
And did you say the trials have already started for that, or?
Yeah, so that was the ones I was involved at Imperial in London. The phase 1/2 was completed in January. So yeah, we'll either move on to a phase 3 now, or go back and iterate on the formulation to further improve it.
That's exciting. That's really exciting. That would be great. So question about immunity. Now we've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to preface them in a minute from people that have written in. We just had a few of our own just to start. One was about immunity, and basically what has science learned about immunity so far with the mRNA vaccines, and the length of immunity from 1 shot, 2 shots, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, we're learning more and more every day, right? So because the clinical trials for these RNA vaccines were started, I guess about a year and 3 months ago, that's all the data that we have for now. And from what I've seen, I guess the last publications that I saw from either Pfizer, BioNTech, or Moderna, it looked like the antibody levels, which is, what we're really interested in seeing as far as the immunity, they look like, out to 6 months, they had basically plateaued. So we'll continue to monitor it, but as far as how long it lasts before it, eventually wanes, we don't have a great time frame for that yet.
It's interesting about that time frame that you're seeing in terms of the 6 month initially. So Saman's had both doses. I've had one, and I was going to get the second one right away. I got the first one just maybe 6 weeks, 2 months ago, not quite 2 months. But I was reading about, I guess, statistics and data that was coming out of Israel and Ireland, that the double vaccinated population was actually showing kind of waning immunity, and more folks were kind of getting infected. But which seemed to be different than what was going on here. So there was, I guess there's a theory that I heard, which was that maybe actually delaying that second dose a little bit. I know the manufacturer were saying they should be a month apart or so, roughly, but that because the way the rollout happened in Canada, and Canada wanted to get that first dose in as many people as possible, a lot of people had to wait longer than the manufacturer's recommendation for the second dose, and that could possibly be a reason why immunity seems to be longer lasting here, perhaps, than Israel. So is that something that you've heard of, or?
Yep. So there's a lot of nuance to that, actually. So the reason that the manufacturers recommend, either 3 or 4 weeks for the interval between doses is because that's what was approved in the clinical trial. So once they start that clinical trial, everybody gets the same interval, because otherwise it's just too varied, right? Like, you just have to keep certain variables the same for the clinical trial so that it's set and you can compare between all of them. So really, these mRNA vaccines, historically, it's kind of interesting because a lot of them were developed for pandemic contexts, actually, to be able to be used quickly and, rolled out rapidly. A lot of the research was done with 3 or 4 week intervals, just because the idea was that you would want to vaccinate people as quickly as possible, right? So it's, the idea was that it's better to get people to peak immunity faster versus waiting longer. I think that didn't quite take into account that we'd be trying to vaccinate almost 8 billion people at the same time. And so that's why, we've seen decisions like from the government of Canada to actually delay that interval beyond what was recommended by the manufacturers. But if you think in the context of other vaccines, a lot of them usually have longer intervals, actually. Like, it's really common to get a vaccine, once every 2 months. And immunologically, this definitely depends from disease to disease. But I think there is a precedent, if you follow like the actual immunity, it does take about 4 to 6 weeks for those memory cells to really start forming and become a robust cell population. So waiting until the 8 months, or 8 week time point, actually might be really beneficial. The hard thing is, as of right now, we don't have data from these big, randomized clinical trials looking at the efficacy and how that interval actually affects it. So like you said, it's like we can kind of glean information from places that have used other intervals, but we don't have kind of those set clinical trials where it's like, okay, this is how 8 weeks compared to 4 weeks, and use that to rationalize these decisions.
Right. Yeah, I guess in Israel, because they got a good supply of the vaccines early, they were able to stick to the manufacturer's, I guess, 1 month interval between shots. So maybe that it's interesting if that does prove, as you're saying, over the long haul to be the reason for the difference. That's going to be a positive thing for people to, I guess, extend the immunity they're going to get.
Yeah, totally. And another really important thing to consider for this is, for COVID, we don't yet have what's called a correlate of protection. So this is just saying, it's kind of a fancy way of saying we don't have something, a biomarker, something that we can measure in your blood that tells us whether you'll be, protected from infection or protected from severe disease. So we don't know what that threshold is yet. And so because of that, right now, the ultimate goal is to just maximize immunity for everybody. So that could be another reason why, these different intervals, have different advantages and however long the immunity lasts for, right?
Right. And I guess, so for whichever country, I guess certainly Israel, because of what we just talked about, but Canada as well. There is, I guess, some evidence that the immunity to the Delta variant isn't as high as to the original strain. It varies, I guess, in the different vaccines. But what I guess we've been hearing, and that there's a question then of when will a booster shot be needed? Potentially, particularly for that variant. So what are you guys hearing about that, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, as far as protection from the variants, this is another really hard thing to quantify actually, because there's kind of two ways we can do it. So we can look in the lab and do what's called a neutralization assay. And so this is just a test that we can do where we take somebody that's been vaccinated with these first generation vaccines and see, okay, how well do the antibodies that these people have neutralize new strains of the virus like Delta? And so when we do that, we do see that there is reduced neutralization against Delta variants and others as well. But that's not a perfect test, right? Because it doesn't, exactly recapitulate, the exact epidemiology of it in the population. And so the other way would really be to just kind of do these studies in the population to observe, how much of it is going around, try to study certain populations, but it's a lot more difficult to say how well it protects compared to the original strain of it as far as the vaccine. But I think we've had enough reports now to say that it seems like it's not as high, although we are still seeing really good protection against severe disease. And the other thing we know is that Delta has really become the primary strain of the virus that's circulating. So probably, now we're starting to collect better and better data on how efficacious it is, because that's basically what is going around at the moment.
Another vaccine I guess we've been hearing about coming out is the Novavax.
Mm-hmm.
And so that one apparently, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that one seems to have done quite well in, I guess, the early trials against the Delta variant. So what are you guys hearing about that? What do you know about that vaccine?
Yeah, so Novavax is a protein-based vaccine. They use a technology that it kind of stabilizes this protein in a form that makes a really good immune response to it. I think the data looks fantastic. One of the problems that I imagine that they'll face is just the scale up of making it. So one of the great advantages that RNA vaccines have is it's made synthetically. So we don't rely. So when scientists say that, really what we mean is we're not relying on cells to produce these at scale, right? So to make a protein, the only way we have to do that right now is to give cells the instructions. We grow them in these huge bioreactors and then purify out the specific protein we want. So this takes time. It takes time for the cells to divide, produce the protein, and then it can be quite a complicated separations process to purify out just the specific protein, the spike protein that we want. For RNA, it's much easier. You don't require cells or just as large infrastructure. You can make about 1 million doses of it in 10 liters. So it's a much more scalable process. So definitely pros and cons, but I think from what I've seen, the immunity data from Novavax looks excellent so far.
Do you think it's going to be available to Canadians at some point next year, or what would your guess be based on?
Hard to say. It depends on, what gets approved and how much they're able to make and distribute.
Okay. So yeah, we were talking a little bit before just about our hope and with this program and our vaccine resistant friends, so family and friends. So yeah, that's I guess one of the things we were really hoping to kind of address. As I mentioned before, both Saman and I have a lot of vaccinated friends as we are, and we have some that aren't, and so trying to answer their concerns from us doesn't have as much weight or credibility as them hearing it from, an expert like yourself. So we asked them for some questions and to send us in their concerns. So they've submitted questions for us. We've written some down. So if you forgive me, I might read off a list of those, and I just want to say that right off the bat, these aren't our questions. So
no worries.
Some of them sound like they're a little bit creative. They're not from us. We're
That's
just
okay. I actually think, yeah, just to preface, I actually think it's actually a really positive thing to be vaccine hesitant. I know that term gets thrown around with a lot of shame, I think in like kind of day-to-day media, but I think actually like, hasn't that been the goal all along for people to question what they've been putting into their bodies? So I actually think that's great. Like, and I think, I guess my role as a scientist and educator is just that I feel like it's my duty to, you know, help people and educate them so that they can make a good decision for themselves about whether to get a vaccine.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I think we both felt as well that we, you know, the important thing was to really respect the concerns people had, and I think the one common refrain we were hearing from people is that they felt like either they couldn't find the information, or there were questions they had that they felt weren't getting answered, and people weren't taking them seriously. So it's brilliant that that you look at it that way, and I think it's a lot better when people are convinced with good arguments and facts than feeling that they're not being heard. So that's brilliant. That's our hope as well. So one of the first things, then just jumping in, was somebody wrote in and asked about adverse effects to vaccines. And so they had written that some of the more serious side effects vaccines have had or have been reported, discounting some of the rare occurrences of anaphylaxis or blood clots with a couple of them, I think Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. So the questioner asked, what do you think could account for the myocarditis and pericarditis that have been recorded in say, young male populations or certain groups? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I would say from what's been published and what's known, we don't quite know the mechanism for that yet. And what I think is really like important is to consider that, yeah, there are often risks to getting a vaccine, right? But I think the way that I think about it is this kind of like risk versus benefit scale. And I think it's important to actually weigh like, okay, what are we actually comparing, right? So I think a lot of times when people think about severe adverse effects from vaccines, they're considering like, okay, vaccine or no vaccine. But what we really should be considering is vaccine or getting COVID, right? Like it's been here, it's going around, like, and, you know, chances are just statistically that eventually you're probably going to be exposed to it and or get it, right? So what we really need to be comparing is, okay, what are the risks associated with getting the vaccine and what are the risks associated with getting COVID? And so now we have really good data, especially I really liked, so Pfizer and BioNTech was recently FDA approved, right? And so now they have like, and that means it goes through a review process where they followed, you know, 20,000 people in the vaccine and placebo groups for 6 months, recorded many, many things about them. So they have great data sets on them. So the one severe adverse effect that is listed in that pamphlet now is myocarditis. So when you think about this, you know, it's again coming back to what are the risks that we're weighing here. And for I think in the Pfizer pamphlet it says it's like the risk is about 2 to 5 out of 100,000 people that get the vaccine. But to put that into perspective, for COVID, the risk of myocarditis is actually much higher. So it's around 7 to 25 out of every 100,000 people that get COVID will get myocarditis. So, and this is essentially true for every adverse event associated with the COVID vaccines, is that the risk is much higher with COVID itself. So yes, there is a risk. Like, I think it's good to be fully transparent about that, but just know the actual risk that you're comparing.
Yeah, it's interesting that what you were saying in the first part of that too, as well, is that we're all being exposed, and at some point our bodies are probably dealing with fighting off a viral load that we aren't even aware of. So when you look at an overall population, let's take British Columbia. So here we are living here. We've seen the COVID rate go up and down a little bit over the course of the pandemic, but certainly it started spiking again with the Delta variant. So I mean, you probably from all the data that you guys have access to have a sense of how much people are actually exposed and how much we're probably dealing with fighting those exposures off sort of on a day-to-day basis. Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So there's actually the BC CDC puts out these kind of weekly reports where they break down like the cases, hospitalizations, like even down to like what variants are going around BC. And so what I think is really interesting in that data to look at and think about is like, yeah, it fluctuates, but what is the most like resounding for me is they actually now can detail, okay, and people that have been hospitalized for COVID or died from COVID, what percentage of them is vaccinated versus unvaccinated? And I want to say the last report I saw was, it was like 86% of the people that had been hospitalized for COVID were unvaccinated. So to me, that's like the most convincing statistic you could have is like, you know, sometimes in scientific papers, we have to do like really fancy statistical tests to like prove that two populations are different or that we're actually seeing an effect. But when it's like 86%, it's really obvious that the vaccines do truly work in preventing severe disease.
And was that 86% completely unvaccinated, or were they counting one dose as well?
Yeah, so I think that was in the unvaccinated part, but they break it down usually by, so completely unvaccinated, partially protected, and then fully vaccinated. So
was the 86% just strictly unvaccinated people?
I believe so, yeah.
Wow, that's dramatic. Just a follow-up question to we were talking about the myocarditis. There was one person that wrote in and they referred to a Japanese study that they had read about that showed basically what was happening to the lipid nanoparticles from the vaccine. And I guess the Japanese study found that the majority of them dispersed through the body or remained in the injection site, dispersed through the body, but they found, I guess, about 15% or something like that, or percentage was in the liver for a short time. And then there were very minute percentages that went into other organs like the heart, the brain, the spleen, and so forth, the lungs. And I guess what this person was writing is that their understanding of the study was that, again, those particles didn't stay in those organs for very long. But their question was, is it possible that because obviously the lipid nanoparticles that are part of the vaccine are associated with the spike protein, at least temporarily, when it's created, is it possible that there could be trace elements of the spike protein, not the protein itself, but trace elements in those nanoparticles, so that, let's say it goes into the heart, maybe that particle is only going to be there for a few days, but that the body's immune system, which has now been activated to react to the spike protein, senses perhaps a little bit like a trace particle in the heart, and perhaps in young men or certain cases where there's a really active immune system, could it be reacting to what it's reading as some spike protein there, and that causing that inflammation response? Is there a theoretical?
Really interesting theory. So I guess I'm not familiar with that study, so I'd have to look more into it. And yeah, hard to know, because really like the best way to do that study would be to do it and take samples in people, right? But it sounds like it was a biodistribution study that probably was done in either mice or rats. And so, depends a lot on like what dose they used and what time points they were looking at, right? So take that with a grain of salt that I haven't seen this study. So I guess from what I have seen in the studies that I've seen, the spike protein is expressed for about 3 to 5 days with these messenger RNA vaccines. So yeah, I guess, yeah, from my understanding, we just don't know quite the mechanism yet of what is causing this myocarditis, but people are definitely looking into it. But I will say as well, in a lot of these cases, the myocarditis, it's not always fatal, right? So many of the patients that have that fully recovered from it.
Right. And you were talking too about the FDA approval. So that's brilliant, because you're just leading right into my next questions. And that was another question someone had written. Now, again, this is some of the stuff they're hearing out there, and I don't know where everything is coming from, but they were talking about the FDA approvals, and actually what they wrote is that there hadn't been a full list of vaccine ingredients released to the public, which normally happens for the end of phase 3 trials and before mass manufacturing, and that the FDA recently asked Pfizer for a full list of ingredients. So do you know anything about that?
I do, yeah. So there's basically 5 main ingredients in the vaccines, and these actually are all available on the Health Canada website. So if you go and you look at each vaccine, it does say all the ingredients in there. So there's 5 different main ingredients. So the RNA is one, and then there's 4 different lipid components: an ionizable lipid, a phospholipid, cholesterol, which is just, the cholesterol that's normally found in our cells, and what's called a pegylated lipid, which helps with the stability of the particles. So there's also some, it's in a buffered liquid. And so there's also some salts and sugars that are included in it, but those are the ingredients. They are fully available from the Health Canada website.
Is the FDA, for their approval, was there a sort of a more detailed list? Because I guess that's what the questioner was wondering, if there's actually a sort of a more detailed list that the FDA requested, or how that normally works.
So I'm not familiar with like this specific inclusion in the FDA approval application, I guess. But I will say, like, when you go to even start your clinical trial, even before that, when you start your preclinical trials, you can't change anything about your formulation. You can't change it actually the entire time. That's why you're locked into the dose, the formulation, the interval that you proposed in the first place. Otherwise, you have to go back and do more clinical trials, do more scale-up data and QC for all of your batches. So the formulations haven't changed this entire time. These are still like the same first generation vaccines. And I'm not sure like what more they're looking for than the components that are in there. But from what I'm aware, like, they're completely public by now. You can even buy like most of these components.
Wow. Okay. I guess I think what they were sort of acting on was some reports that I guess Pfizer changed the name of the vaccine to Comirnaty or something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that started a rumor that perhaps the vaccine that was being approved wasn't the one that was actually currently being used, but it was the booster coming up.
I see. So this is probably like kind of a slightly nuanced thing, but just, you're not allowed to give a drug or a medicine its own name until after it's FDA approved. It's the exact same vaccine. Absolutely nothing has changed about it, because all that paperwork and tracing and dating data has been with this single formulation. So it just got a name for marketing purposes.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's such a simple explanation to kind of a rumor, I think, that's been running rampant out there based on what I saw from that question. So it's such a simple response to some of these things that if people just understood, they'd feel a lot better.
It just has to do, and it like logically it makes sense, right? Because if something is still under emergency use authorization or going through clinical trials, you can't be advertising that it works before it's approved, basically, right? So it really has to do with just like the advertisement of drugs, which actually like is very different in the States anyways, right? It's like, when you go there, like, you see commercials for drugs, which like you don't experience in like many other countries worldwide. I think the US and New Zealand are like the only places that have that. So that's what it has to do with, is just like marketing for the actual product.
And then someone else wrote about graphene oxide. I'd never heard of that before, but they said they were worried about the possible presence of graphene oxide in the vaccines. And they said they believed a rumor about that because there was some information that some of the nanolipids used in the vaccines have accompanying hydrogels in which graphene oxide is listed as one of the ingredients. of the hydrogels. So is there any facts to that at all, or what do you know about that?
Nope. So it's possible that these lipids in other contexts have been used in combination with graphene oxide for other applications. They're quite like, for the most part, they're quite common lipids. And, some of them like cholesterol are even just, natural components of all of our cells. But graphene oxide is not used in the manufacturing. It's not a part of the vaccine. Like there is none in the actual formulation.
So that one just basically started because the nanolipids, which are used in lots of different things, in some applications for other things, may have had graphene oxide, but just because it was used in something else, another product or something very, very far removed from the mRNA vaccines, people are associating that or sort of making a connection from.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the origin of that would be, but I guess this is where the transparency as to the ingredients really comes in handy. Like, go look there, you will not find graphene oxide.
Good. No, that's great. It's just great to again hear just a very straightforward, simple explanation that kind of unwinds some of the confusion that folks are experiencing. Booster shots. So again, someone wrote there were reports in Politico and Business Insider magazines that basically talking about the 2 or 3 top officials from the FDA that resigned recently. And I guess what they were reporting is that was the resignations were because President Biden in the States was aggressively advocating for booster shots before the FDA could do a proper risk assessment and analysis of those. So what have you heard about that? Or should we say feel safe with the booster shots? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, great question. So I guess, as it was bound to, it got quite political. So I think that was really just like a political thing, with this kind of balance between the FDA and Biden. I guess for myself and how I would evaluate this is just let's wait to see what the data is like before we know what the need for a booster shot is, right? So, it's super complicated right now because we're actually very privileged, right? Like we live in a country where there's loads of vaccines that are available. Basically, everybody has access to them. But for many other countries all over the world, they don't have the same access to vaccines. And so I think that's another thing we need to consider when we're thinking about, okay, do we give the population a 3rd dose before, maybe exporting those to other countries, through COVAX or similar programs, which helps to distribute them all over the world. Because I think what we've learned from this pandemic is that like we're not an island, right? Like COVID doesn't respect our borders. And, with global travel and how accessible it is, even though it's, still pretty limited today, people can get through the borders. And so that means that we're not really protected until the entire world is protected. So that's another thing we need to weigh, right? Is thinking about people all over the world, how much the pandemic is kind of being controlled in other places as well before, Canadian government officials make a decision about like, okay, when is the time to have a booster? And that will depend on lots of things. Like, again, we're really lucky because we have access to potential 3rd doses if we need them. But, let's see, like, is it still the same strain going around? Are new vaccines that are more effective against whatever circulating strains available now? Should that be instead? And then just waiting to see how long the antibodies last for. But for me, I guess, this is like, it's a very like highly political thing at this point in time. But I guess what I'm comforted by is that you can always go back to the data, right? It's like, okay, what do we know about what is the actual need for a booster shot? And there may be one day, but I don't think we know yet.
So you'd say at this point, the data isn't there to support needing a booster shot at this point.
Yeah, I think we're waiting to find out basically, how long does immunity last in the population? How well are people being protected? It may very well end up being that, we get an annual booster dose similar to like we do with the flu. But I think it just hasn't been defined yet.
And someone else had written, they were talking about breakthrough cases, and they wrote us about a study, I guess, a Mayo Clinic study, that reported symptoms of people that had been vaccinated, double vaccinated in the study, that some were evidencing acute kidney injury, thrombocytopenia, did I say that right? Cardiac arrest, cardiac arrhythmia, chronic fatigue syndrome, brain inflammation, hypertension, and sepsis. That's a heck of a list. Now those sound like, and I guess what they were saying is those sound like actual, I guess they're COVID symptoms, but there's the question, I guess the questioner's curiosity was, are those COVID symptoms or are those side effects to the vaccine?
Right. So with the breakthrough infections, I guess what's important to consider is when we say, the vaccines are, 94, 95% effective, the end of that sentence that often gets left out is against severe COVID disease, right? And so that means that it's actually not a vaccine that whole 100% prevents you from getting the infection. It doesn't 100% prevent you from transmitting the virus either. And so really what it is it prevents you from getting severe disease. So there will be breakthrough cases. That means, people that have gotten vaccinated that then get COVID. But from the data that we've seen, those side effects then that they get are from getting COVID. But the data is, very resounding at this point in time that the severity of disease is much less if you've been vaccinated.
And I guess the thing that they were, again, their concern that I was reading into that question was, are people like in that Mayo study, and I know you haven't seen the study perhaps, so you can't comment absolutely, but their concern was, were people potentially getting those symptoms from as vaccine side effects? Is that even possible?
Yeah, so I guess, so I haven't seen that study. So yeah, take this with a grain of salt. But, if there were cases where, or I guess if there was a huge population of people that were getting, I guess, more severe side effects from the vaccine or from COVID with these breakthrough infections, it would be really immensely obvious, right? Because there's been so many people that have gotten vaccinated now and, thus been exposed to COVID also very likely. So yeah, from what I'm aware of, those are known to be associated with COVID. When you get the COVID infection, it's not something that's triggering something in the vaccine that you had, maybe weeks ago to create some sort of, side effect way after your dose.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like somebody had read about the study and that some people who were double vaccinated got those symptoms, and rather than thinking, oh, okay, those are just breakthrough cases, they leapt to the assumption that perhaps they were vaccine symptoms. So that's.
Can I jump in here, if you don't mind, with a question about the breakthrough cases? I was actually speaking to a person yesterday, and one of the worries that they had specifically with regards to the vaccine and the vaccine passport that has basically just come into effect is that the people who are vaccinated may be experiencing COVID, may get COVID, but because their symptoms are very reduced compared to a person who's not vaccinated, they actually have the ability to infect a lot more people without realizing it because their symptoms are not as severe enough for them to realize that they're actually sick. Is there anything to that claim?
Interesting idea. So I guess what I know about this is that, so like I said earlier, so while it's not 100% effective at preventing infection or 100% effective at preventing transmission, it is somewhat effective against both of those, right? And so even though we know that there are asymptomatic carriers of even COVID, and especially even with breakthrough cases, I don't think it's that, we still are you see a reduction in the infections, you see a reduction in the transmission from it. So it's not I guess statistically, it means that it's not like this huge population of vaccinated people that are going around and, getting infected and transmitting it much more than unvaccinated people, because you do see partial protection for both of those.
Yeah, I heard about that too. And that was, somebody had written about that. I didn't include that in the first list of questions, but they had asked, is it possible, because there was, again, a bit of a theory going out there that vaccinated people, as Saman was saying, are actually transmitting it more as sort of asymptomatic transmission. And even, and the part B of that, oh, sorry, I was just going to add the part B of that, which was that may account for more of the rise of the variants, which, yeah, I wasn't, that's, I don't know how they made that leap, but I just wanted to ask you about it.
I see. So I guess the best answer that I have is that we just really don't know, right? Like, we're doing such a poor job of tracking transmission in the general population. It's not like everybody's getting tested every single week or something like that, right? So I don't think and we know, like, there's lots of people that get COVID as well that are asymptomatic. So it's a really hard thing to say, like, okay, vaccinated people are responsible for transmitting this many infections this week, or unvaccinated people are responsible for transmitting this many infections, right? So I just don't think we have the epidemiological data to be able to make conclusions about that at this point. But what we do know is that if you have some sort of partial protection from a vaccine, it means you're, some X percentage less likely to get infected and transmit the virus.
What about the part B of that theory, which I believe the sort of logic is that that somehow when someone is double vaccinated, that when a person say gets infected or is exposed to COVID, that there's a mutation that happens because the virus is trying to get around the vaccination protection, and that could actually be causing more of the mutations and variants.
Yeah, I mean, viruses evolve anyways. They're constantly trying to do that, no matter if you have, natural immunity from COVID or immunity from a vaccine against COVID. So these mutations, it's basically just, they're trying to become the most fit virus possible. And so really what we're trying to do with the vaccine is limit kind of the number of reservoirs, human reservoirs, that they have to mutate in, right? And so that means, if you have, like I said, like a reduced chance of, getting infected, of transmitting it, of getting severe disease where you have virus present in your body for a long time. This is just, once you limit those reservoirs, you're also limiting the mutations that may arise.
Did you have a follow-up question, Saman?
Not at the moment. No, I'll let you continue.
Oh, okay. Okay. I thought you had something there, so I just wanted to give you a chance to jump in there. So, Dr. Blakney, I guess we're getting close to the end of the interview, and I guess maybe a way to kind of wrap it up and take your time with the answer, because it's a big question. But we did have people writing in and saying, well, how does science envision the pandemic ending? And will it just run its course after 4 or 5 waves? Is it realistic to think we can vaccinate everybody and stop it? One person wrote, well, the virus keeps mutating and changing. Does that mean more and more boosters chasing herd immunity while the virus keeps mutating and adapting? So how do you see that all playing out?
Yeah, it's a good question, and honestly, just really hard to predict, right? So from a scientific perspective, I would just say, like, we don't have an idea yet. But I guess for me, what kind of comforts me in looking forward is that we've already seen that the vaccines that we have are so effective, right? And like, I think I often have to take a moment to appreciate just like how incredible it is that we already within this time frame of the pandemic have vaccines that are available to billions of people and work so well, because it could have taken years longer to have that, right? If the first generation of candidates just hadn't worked. So because of that, looking forward, I think from a vaccine perspective, we're actually really lucky because this technology makes it so easy to pivot and make a, if suddenly there's a new variant or something that's really, really transmissible, then it's really easy to pivot and make a new vaccine against that. We know we can scale the technology and we know they work really well. So, potentially maybe it just, comes to a steady state eventually where it still circulates in the population like the flu. Maybe you have to get an annual booster. It's really hard to say at this point in time.
And it seems like there's efforts obviously around the world globally to get vaccines to people. There's obviously different vaccines and brands in different countries. Do you think that, or I guess the question would be, where are we at in terms of overall vaccination for the world? Is there a percentage of folks that we know are already, if we could say 70% of the world is vaccinated, or and if that's the case, the rest we think will be at 90% within a year, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I want to say the last number that I saw for how many people had been vaccinated was like 2.1 billion. So that would be like 2.1 billion out of 7.7 billion and growing, right? So we're not at like 83% or whatever we're at in Canada now for the whole world. So there's still a lot of work to be done in these other countries as well. So yeah, I think, we're moving towards it every day. And yeah, I just feel super grateful that we have so many available vaccines, and I hope we continue to use them wisely and distribute them to people that are really in need as well.
I heard an interview with Dr. Michael Osterholm, I think, from the States, and he's been great. I've been listening to him over the last couple of years in the course of the pandemic, and just very impressive. He predicted a lot of the stuff that's happened. So he talked about, he envisioned kind of a need for a Marshall Plan like the States did with Japan after the Second World War, where they just kind of marshaled all these resources. The Marshal was referring actually to a general, but it's a double entendre because they actually did pull a great effort together to help Japan rebuild. So he was envisioning a similar kind of campaign to get to the rest of those 5 billion people you just talked about in the world. So obviously that's a massive effort, and it's underway. In the meantime, I know that there's been better drug therapy and treatment for critical care in the hospitals, and I think it's dexamethasone and some of the steroids and other things that are used in the ICUs. What are there other drug therapies in that interim while the world's trying to scale up to global vaccination? Are there other drug therapies that you know of that are being looked at that could help in the meantime for these populations that maybe aren't getting to the vaccines just as quickly, but there's something they can do other than just they're keeping their immune systems as healthy as possible? Are there any other drugs out there that you're aware of?
So the only other one I would say that I know of that is, like FDA or Health Canada approved are the monoclonal antibody therapies. So there's like two different candidates. So one is made actually by a company in Vancouver called Accelera that partnered with Eli Lilly. And the other is in the States, which is made by a company called Regeneron. But these aren't really they're really highly effective. Like a lot of, like that's what they treated Donald Trump with when he got COVID. So they work really well for treatment of COVID, but the problem is that it's just not like a highly scalable, like they're really expensive. They're not going to be like available worldwide because they're like a quite tricky to produce biologic product. But that's the only other thing. As far as like the actual like treatment and critical care, yeah, from what I'm aware of, like from, clinicians who I know who treat patients in the ICU, it's basically like dexamethasone is the main go-to for them.
I know some of the folks had written in about ivermectin, which I know is quite controversial. I guess there's studies pro and con. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually I don't find it to be controversial. I think it's gotten controversial in just that there's a lot of misinformation going around about it. So ivermectin is, yes, it is an FDA approved drug for treatments of different diseases. I would say from a scientific perspective, it is conclusive that there just hasn't been a study that's shown that ivermectin itself, like in a randomized clinical trial, is effective at treating COVID-19. So I know that, yeah, it's been going around. I think there's often the assumption that like if you're really pro-vax, like you don't want anything else, you're really biased towards vaccines. But I would like to be using every tool that we possibly have, right? Like if everybody could be getting, monoclonal antibody treatments when they get COVID, that would be awesome. Like if somebody should do a randomized clinical trial of ivermectin to see if it is actually effective. I'm all for that. Like I'm not trying to like squash ivermectin in the public discourse. From the studies I've seen so far, there's no conclusive evidence showing that it's an effective treatment for COVID-19.
I love what you just said, though. I love what you just said, because I was talking to my wife and just saying, we're both saying the same thing, which is, everybody just wants this to be over, and why not use every tool in the toolkit? So if there's anything that could possibly work, why not do those randomized trials? Why not check it out just as as an assist? Because like you said, there's 7 billion people out there, and we're trying to get everyone vaccinated, but it takes a while, and obviously, so that's wonderful to hear on that front. So I guess just as we're kind of coming to a close here, is there anything else that you'd like to share, either in your research or thoughts you've had, or things that you'd like people to know? Or
yeah, I really just, I guess I'd just like to reiterate that just from, my experiences with what I've learned from talking to people about vaccines in this entire pandemic is just that, yeah, I really go back to this, like we have this dichotomy of, anti-vax and pro-vax that just gets, repeated in the media pretty much daily. But I would say from the people I've talked to, like the vast majority of people is in this gray area in between. And so I think it's actually really great to be vaccine hesitant. And I guess I just encourage people to, actually look into and follow data-driven sources where people post the links to whatever journal article they're posting. And if you realize you're reading something and you're getting like a super emotional reaction to it, maybe take a pause and think about, okay, where is this information coming from? And that's also a good time to then start looking into, okay, where is the data from this coming from? And if you can't find it, that's usually a good indicator that it's not a good piece of information.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic advice. Just what you're saying about taking a pause and also, kind of, it's okay to be vaccine hesitant for the folks that are. It's okay to want to feel that you're getting the information you need to get to feel comfortable. And that's really what Saman and I, our goal was to actually be able to give people a voice and let them ask those questions of an expert, of someone who can answer them like you have. And our goal really with our show, which is called the Middle Way Podcast, it is, like you're saying, it's been so hard to stay in the middle and be right through this whole thing. There's such a pressure, and that we've talked about and we've noticed for people to go to the extremes. Mm-hmm. And so just to stay in the middle and look at the science and look at things reasonably and not get pulled into the emotion has been difficult. So we hoped to make the podcast a forum, a place where we could bring people together and we could listen to each other and we could get the real information, which you've done a brilliant job of bringing us today. So we'd like to thank you so much.
My pleasure. Yeah, and I absolutely support what you guys are doing. So thanks for having me. Thank
you very much. Our guest today has been Professor Anna Blakney with the University of British Columbia, and we love your contribution, and we might even try to get you on again. I'm sure there's going to be more questions after this show. So if you're available, that would be brilliant. So
sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Dr. Blakney. Thanks.
So hello, everybody. We're just coming back from a break after our terrific interview with Professor Anna Blakney with University of British Columbia. And wow, that was quite an interesting conversation. What did you think, Simon?
Absolutely, yeah. Very enlightening, very answered a lot of questions for me. So yeah, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it did for me too. I was actually really struck by a few things. One was just how easily and simply explained some of the common misconceptions were, like just things like, a lot of the rumors out there about Pfizer and Comirnaty, and did Pfizer apply to the FDA to license the future vaccine, so it's not the one that people have now? Is that some kind of trying to get around things? And she explained that so simply that you can't actually name a vaccine until it's FDA approved. So that just dispelled that one so quickly. And the other one I was struck by too was the graphene oxide, which is another big rumor that was sort of sweeping the dark web and some of the alternative sites, because people thought that, oh my gosh, there's this graphene oxide, which can be a very toxic ingredient in the vaccines. And as she pointed out, it's not in these vaccines, and that rumor probably got started because lipid nanoparticles are used in so many things. And, let's say there's 100 or 200 different applications. There might be one or two for other products where it's used, and probably not in a product that's used in humans or they use graphene oxide. So because it was used in something else at some point, somebody made the leap that it must be in everything with nanoparticles. So that was again a really simple explanation.
Absolutely, yeah. Just when you think about certain things that tend to be such a huge burden on you mentally, and you toss these ideas around in your head on a regular basis, and you make it bigger and bigger and bigger every day, and then with a very quick and small point that's made by somebody, you realize that, okay, that was very easy to get rid of. Okay,
Yeah.
done. Simple. It's
Yeah,
actually very interesting.
It is. It's kind of like that old adage, of how rumors get started. It can just start with take something that's true, and then there's just one little variation to that.
Yeah.
And then the next person that passes that along, it has another variation and another variation. By the time
Add to it and add to it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. By the time it gets back to the first person, it's a completely different story. So that was fascinating, and I think, and also really helpful that she was able to explain some of those things and dispel some of the myths that have been happening. The other thing I was struck by was just her whole demeanor and approach, and just how open she was to answering our questions. She there was nothing off base, nothing that was out of bounds that she wasn't willing to discuss. And so embracing. She welcomed people's skepticism and caution, and saw that as a good thing. And I was just really struck that, by the thought that, if more people, whether they're government officials, medical people, scientific, or, in any part of this whole phenomena that's occurred, if there were more people that were coming from the place that she was coming from, just how different things would have been, in a sense. Because, if we had that chance to have people like her, scientific experts, really just like saying, ask anything you want, and really laying it out, and opening the doors to knowledge that way, I think with such an openness, I think that would have been a very different dynamic. And hopefully going forward, if we can interview her again, or if that energy and that approach and attitude comes into the discourse, that would be great.
Yeah, and it makes me think, you're right. If we were given the opportunity to ask questions and have them answered so freely from the very beginning, the way that people would interact with everything that's gone on for the past couple of months could be completely different. Now, I understand that we were in an emergency situation, and in an emergency, you don't have time to question certain things. You're like, put on your mask, don't ask why. The plane's going down, oxygen mask is dropped, put it on, don't ask why, because you only have a couple of seconds. But at the same time, if you know why you're putting the oxygen mask on, as the plane is going down, or even better than that is they tell you put your own mask on first and then help others that need it, right? And the reason for doing that is because you only have 3 or 4 seconds of consciousness when the cabin loses pressure, right? So if you put somebody else's mask on first, you're not going to get to yourself. But if you put your own mask on first, then you can help the others, everybody else, not just the one person sitting next to you, 10 or 15 people around you, maybe you'd be able to help. So, you don't have the time to explain that. But at the same time, if you know the reason behind why you have to do it, it makes it a lot easier to do.
Well, I think so. And I think, I think that's a good analogy in a sense in a pandemic, is that the system is scrambling kind of to deal with the crisis, and then it gets around to explaining why later. And I think that made a lot of sense in the beginning for those reasons. I'm totally with you. But now I think we're at the point where, let's say where it comes to vaccines, where people have really dug in. There's people that are, majority that are on side and positive and gone along with the message. And then there's a percentage that have really dug in the other way, and that's where I think that group needs the information. They need the approach we just saw from her. Absolutely. So I think that's hopefully with this this program and others that we can do, we can bring that for both sides. Really, we bring that information. Even people that have had vaccines, a lot don't really understand what they've taken. They know it's a vaccine, but they don't know why it works, or what are what are the ups and downsides, or why not to be worried, or what to think about going forward. So I think that'd be great. The other thing I was going to just point out was, because it's probably not her field of research, I was aware as I was asking the questions that our listeners had sent in, that Dr. Blakney was less familiar with a couple of the studies that people were quoting, whether there was the Japanese study on the diffusion of the lipid nanoparticles, or it was the Mayo Clinic study. So those studies dealt more with adverse effects and potential reasons for why they're occurring, and different actual, not conspiracy stuff, but real bona fide scientific theories that are being sort of discussed out there. So I just thought, in fairness, as we've talked about in terms of having balance and bringing people together, showing both sides and bringing people together in the conversation, it might be nice just to have an episode where we talk to some people that are having adverse effects. We might even be able to find a scientist who could maybe talk a little bit further about what could be causing those. I ran into a woman that I know from my in my neighborhood, actually, from a restaurant that I go to, and we got talking, and she's had some considerable adverse effects. So I think she's willing to talk to us and come on a podcast and share her experience. So I thought that would be interesting as well.
Oh, I completely agree. And one of the things that we need to remember about medicine and science in general is that we don't have all the answers, and I don't think we ever will have all the answers. We're learning something new every day. Every day there's a new study that comes out, and you take the information that you had yesterday and then you look at it with the lens of everything that you are learning today. So yes, definitely things that we know today might be different than what we knew yesterday. what seems to be working today might be different from what seemed to be working yesterday. And I think we, like I said, we learn something new every day, and the only way to make sense of it is to continuously update and continuously look at what's going on today, and then reevaluate on a regular basis.
Yeah. Because one thing, I mean, and again, if we're bringing in one or two people or a few people who've had adverse effects, we can get more into that in that episode. But one thing I could mention now is that certainly with, let's say, with the myocardia, which is heart inflammation, and again, that seems to be affecting younger men and certain population groups more. But that's basically, it's an inflammation. And so what I had read, sort of going into some of the science behind the questions people had asked, is that whether it's myocardia, which is heart inflammation, or it's a neurological thing, it seems to be inflammation, which can be a response in a vaccine. So
any
one
kind
of the
immune
things,
response, actually.
What's that? Sorry.
Any kind of immune response. So inflammation
Yeah,
is
exactly.
an immune response. Yeah.
Exactly. And so one of the things that may evolve out of this whole thing is science realizing, okay, take the vaccine, but here's some anti-inflammatory, anti-inflammation type of things that should be
Go
taken
along
within
with
a
it.
couple of days or
Absolutely.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to suppress the immune response, but you want to mitigate dangerous inflammation or inflammation that could be a problem. Because I had a friend who in her second Pfizer shot, she was struggling. And I remember we talked, and so I had just suggested, take some antioxidants, a lot of concentrated vitamin C or something. And she did that, and she felt better within a day. So there may be just things like that, but we can certainly explore that more in that episode.
I think it's definitely worth exploring. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, cool. So just bringing the whole conversation we had with Dr. Blakney back to the middle way. Yeah, I was just really knocked out by a couple of things she said that sort of really bring it back to what inspired us to create this show. And one of the things that she said in that regard was that there's perhaps the largest percentage of people, in the sort of vaccine issue. Most of us are in the gray area, even if people have sort of vaxxed or not vaxxed. That there's this gray area, and the gray area is the people that aren't extreme. Because yes, there are people certainly in extremes on both sides, whether it's pro-vax and very aggressive against the protesters, or the protesters who are anti-vax, or maybe they're not anti-vax but they're anti-passport, and they're really militant, and they're out in some conspiracy world. And so there seems to be these extremes, and then there's the rest of us in the middle who are actually just trying to be kind of understand the truth, not get too carried away, not get too emotional, and like she said, to kind of step back and kind of look at the facts and sort our way through it. I thought that was.
And she said it's okay to be skeptical, which I think is a beautiful thing to say, and it makes me feel a lot better, because to be honest with you, as you said, there are people who are very, very very, very passionate in their feelings on both sides. The people who are really against the vaccine, and then there are people who are really for the vaccine, and then there's the majority of people that are probably going to take it. They're not certain, they're a little hesitant. And she said it's okay to be hesitant. It's okay to be skeptical. It's okay for you to be aware of what you are choosing to put in your body. And I think that's a wonderful thing to say. Do the research, understand whether it's good for you or not, and then take the decision without being afraid to be on one side or the other side. So I think that's, I think that was a very, very middle path thing of her to say.
Yeah, very, very middle path. Yeah, I exactly. And I just felt like bringing things back full circle to the theme of the show. Just, when she talked about that gray area, how and that really the instinct of most people is, yeah, we all get excited, we all can get thrown off, we all can get kind of stimulated, and then after go, oh gosh, what happened there? I lost myself for a second. And that's an interesting statement right there when we say I've lost myself.
Yeah.
What is the self that we lose in those moments? And I think the self that we lose is that actual bigger self, that more conscious self, that conscious awareness that the Buddha was talking about. And when we come back to our kind of self, we're coming back to that awareness and that more, holistic, that larger point of view. And I felt like in that place where people can come together, listen to each other, come together and reason and good faith in that charting that middle path of understanding, I think that's really where the healing, both culturally, socially, the division that's gone on, I think the coming together and the healing is really going to come from that middle path and that listening and coming back to ourselves and really having that respect and compassion for ourselves and each other, and just using, as she said, using all the tools. I mean, that's just how simple a statement, but with a pandemic, why would anybody reasonable say, well, let's use everything available. Let's use the vaccines that are available. Let's use the proven drug therapies, as she said, the ones that have had, clinical trial success and peer-reviewed trial success. So, yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well, Pat, I think that was a wonderful episode. Thank you very much for everything, for putting it together, for finding Dr. Blakney for us, for answering so many questions that so many people have been asking for so long.
Yeah, I was knocked out by it. Thanks, buddy. I it was a pleasure to bring her in and then have you there and for us to discuss it after. I think it's a really good, hopefully a good step, and hopefully it, as we talked about before, hopefully it's something that people will find of value. We hope we provided some answers for those of you that are listening to the program, and we'll continue to try and do that. So stay tuned to the Middle Way Podcast. This has been Pat.
And this is Saman, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The Middle Way Podcast with Pat and Saman.